It's pretty understood that regardless of people's feelings about whatever his newest games are like, Sonic is one of the biggest video game mascots to ever exist. I don't need to give you the whole spiel, we've all heard it a million times over. Yes, in the 90s, he rivaled Mario, was even beating him at one point in time. Yes, let's move on. I bring that up because, well, if you were there, you'd know just how much Sonic had taken over at the time. And whenever that happens, there's bound to be imitators, and there were. Today, I want to take a look at some of those imitators, but I don't want to stop there. Not only that, I want to check out some games on the other side of the spectrum, ones that weren't trying to imitate, necessarily, but rather games that were heavily inspired by Sonic. The intention behind these two ways of going about making a game typically yields two very different results, so let's take a look at some of them. But first, I want to take a minute to talk about this video's sponsor, Displate. Displate is a one-of-a-kind metal poster designed to fit your unique interests with so many different options to choose from, and unlike normal posters, they'll last the test of time due to being constructed out of sturdy, magnet-mounted metal. This means not only will they last, but you can rearrange them whenever you're feeling like a change without damaging anything. Displate has both branded and artistic work with over 1 million designs available that span so many different interests that you may have. Like, I thought it was going to be a long shot that they'd have a Felix the Cat design, and lo and behold, I now have a Felix the Cat poster that's going to last me basically forever. Each poster is a high-quality design printed directly onto metal and hand-signed by their master of production. An installation is also extremely easy due to Displate's magnet mounting system and only takes like 20 seconds. No drilling required. Just wipe your wall down with a cleaning wipe, stick a protective leaf, place a magnet, and put Displate right on the wall. Displate delivers its products worldwide in only 4 to 5 business days. They're eco-friendly and are a great alternative to standard paper posters, which often get damaged and then turn into garbage. It also makes the perfect gift, and it just so happens to be the gifting season. Displate makes a great gift for pretty much anybody due to the fact that they have so many options for anyone, no matter what they may be into. So if you want to get a great gift for someone in time for the holidays, use discount code GILLY or my link in the description to get 22% off on orders of 1 to 2 Displates and 33% off for 3 or more at checkout. It's really a great gift idea and also helps support the channel. I highly recommend checking them out, even if you just want to spoil yourself this year. And thanks once again to Displate for sponsoring the video. Okay, as per usual, we're going to be looking at all these games in order of release, but because of the nature of this type of video and how it needs to be structured so I can make it a little tidy, I'm going to look at them in order of the release of the actual series themselves and not necessarily every individual title. I know none of this matters, but hey, that's how I'm going to do it. 6 minutes into the video, you'll probably forget anyway. All right, let's go. In the summer of 1993, Vic Takai released a game for the Genesis called Socket, or Time Dominator First, later in Japan. This game was more than a little bit influenced by Sonic the Hedgehog, not only by its physics and level design, but even a lot of mechanics and level assets. The story follows the main mascot character, a duck named Socket, I think he's a duck, as he tries to take down the evil Time Dominator, who created a time machine to steal treasures from the past, and by doing so creates a warp in the flow of time. Socket is part of a group called the Time Warp Patrol, and is tasked with stopping the Time Dominator and fixing the flow of time. The level setup is kind of weird in this game. Just like Sonic, each stage is broken up into multiple acts, but instead of having 2 or 3 straightforward platforming stages that only differ by an increase of difficulty, each act takes a different approach to the fundamental design philosophy of said stage. See, each first act is always what this game calls a high-speed zone, which acts as a gateway to the 2 main themed stages of each group of levels. These are, like the name suggests, stages where you basically blaze through them. There isn't a whole lot of enemies to stand in your way, and these zones mainly act as a way to experience the speed the game really wants you to have without all the pesky platforming to get in the way. These zones don't really share the same aesthetic as Zones 2 and 3 though, because the speed stage is basically the travel through time stage. The second zones of each stage are called athletic zones, and once again, as you might imagine, these are more straightforward platforming stages more akin to a typical Sonic game, with the goal of making it to the end. Mind you, with much less tight physics, but we'll get to that. Zone 3 is the Labyrinth Zone. No, not that Labyrinth Zone, although the game does do that too. These stages are similar to the athletic ones, but this time progression isn't linear. You basically need to explore the stages to find the right door that leads you to the boss of each area. Some doors, though, lead you to some pretty challenging platforming rooms, and only some of the time does entering certain doors pay off. Sometimes you need to enter a door to progress to the next area of a stage, and other times you waste your time with a door that doesn't help you progress at all. The bosses, with the exception of the final one, are all piss easy. Keeping with the Sonic theme, you can spam attack all the bosses, even more so than in Sonic, and honestly, it's basically pointless to even try to learn the boss's attack patterns, and you're better off just spamming attacks, because they'll run out of hit points long before you do. And that brings me to the next mechanic here. One thing this game does do that's original is how it approaches the health system. Unlike Sonic's ring system, Socket uses an energy meter, which both depletes gradually as time passes and gets zapped by big chunks if you collide with an enemy or stage hazard. Scattered throughout the stages are lightning bolts, similar to rings in Sonic. If you're low on energy, you pick up the lightning bolts and refill your meter. And you're gonna want to make sure that is filled up because the alarm sound effect that relentlessly plays is akin to actual torture. Never again will I complain about the sound effect in Zelda 1 when you have low health. Now, you can pick up your standard bonus fare. 1-ups, invincibility that lasts like 3 seconds, and the barrier, which is basically like the shield in Sonic. This doesn't stop your energy from going down due to time, but it does eat one of the hits for you if you happen to get hurt. There is so much pulled directly from Sonic, it's honestly kind of funny. But as I said, with much worse physics. They're manageable, like the game isn't unplayable by any means, but it also doesn't feel good to play, necessarily. Because the levels, in a lot of cases, are designed very similarly to Sonic, and the game does try to utilize slopes in a very similar way, but the physics and controls just aren't tight enough for it to feel good. And it's also very difficult to get speed sometimes, and those times always just so happen to emerge whenever you're faced with an upward slope, especially when it comes to the late game stages. What also doesn't help is the weird use of color. Don't get me wrong, the art direction is fine, standard cartoony game, but sometimes it's really hard to tell what objects have collision and which don't. This isn't always a problem, but it did get me killed on more than one occasion when I thought I was leaping onto a platform that wasn't actually a platform. It also just gets very messy and busy sometimes, and I occasionally don't even realize I'm about to get hit by a stage hazard because there's just too many things going on and I'm being bombarded by 10 million colors all at once. When sprite-based platformers get too busy with stage assets and elements without the proper use of color, outline, shading, and lighting to balance it all out, it ends up just looking like a mess and makes it hard to focus, much less even see what's actually going on. Honestly, Socket wasn't all that bad. It was a fine game, I guess. It's just not really very good, but it's also not that bad either. It just kind of exists. It's like a Sonic clone that doesn't really excel at anything, but it doesn't do anything particularly egregious either, enough for me to really bash it anyway, besides it just being a blatant clone of Sonic. The final boss, though, is complete bullshit. No. Him and his 3 phases can get f***ed. You ever play a game where it genuinely makes you viscerally upset when you get a 1-up because you just want an excuse to stop playing? That'd be Awesome Possum Kicks Dr. Machino's Butt, a game by Tengen released back in 1993 for the Genesis. It's supposed to be an educational game, at least to some degree, but there's really nothing to actually be learned here, but we'll get to that. The plot of the game is explained in the intro cutscene, where some quick exposition tells us that the game takes place 20 years in the future. Wait, the game came out in 1993. That means... Uh-oh. Mankind has automated the destruction of the environment with a bunch of robots and shit, all led by the evil Dr. Machino. Dr. Machino's very close to reaching complete environmental destruction, and the only one who can stop him is this guy. Why'd it have to be this guy? Awesome Possum, if you can possibly wrap your head around this one, is basically store-brand Bubsy. He spends the entire game spewing out one-liners which somehow, to my surprise, are less charming than that of Bubsy. I don't get how you can go belower than 0, but here we are.
I'm awesome!
And apparently the digitized speech was a pretty big advertised selling point for this game, despite the actual voice samples being extremely low quality and annoying to listen to. So you basically make your way through each stage, picking up trash, which act as Awesome Possum's coin in this game, getting to the end goal. There's 3 levels in each world, and the third always has a boss at the end. Now, every time you pick up 50 pieces of trash, you get a 1-up and your health refills. And you're gonna need it because this game is as cheap as they come. The game weirdly has this element of momentum in it, but rarely is it a good idea to actually go fast. Going fast can help you clear big chunks of stage if you jump at the right time, but you're essentially doing all this blind. Always. You can never see what's above or below you, and enemies are always in like the worst, most cheap possible places they could possibly be. And it also doesn't help that the hitboxes are super jank, so a lot of the times you'll try to bounce on an enemy's head to eliminate them, only to realize you just fell to one side of the enemy, then getting hit by it, and the worst part about all of this is that the game doesn't even have iframes. I'm sure a lot of you know what that is, but basically, normally in a game, if you get hit, there's a little bit of a grace period after you take damage where you're invincible, allowing you to either take control of the situation or get yourself out of it. Awesome Possum doesn't have that. What it does have is enemies that will spam hit you until you either die or drain like 3/4 of your health at the drop of a hat. Now, I said this game is supposed to be sort of an educational game, and I say sort of because besides there being a whole save the planet message, the game doesn't actually teach you anything. What it does have, though, are pop quiz questions at the end of each stage, which the game never actually gives you the answers for. These questions typically have to do with either pollution or facts about animals, and though I don't know the answers to the animal questions without consulting Google, I can assure you, if you need the answers to nearly any of the pollution questions, just look at the multiple choice answers, and there's about a 99% chance it's just whatever the one is that sounds the worst. Now, as I said, there's 3 levels per world, and there's also only 4 worlds here. It's not a particularly long game, but it sure is frustrating, especially when it comes to the bosses. There's nothing really to them besides just bouncing on their heads, but they run back and forth so frantically and the controls are so sloppy that you really need to plan your jumps like 4 steps ahead, because the boss enemies are way faster and way more precise than this game allows you to be. Now, most of these levels are straightforward platforming ones, but par for the course with a game of this quality, it needs to do something terrible right out the gate, and literally the second world you get thrown into is a series of the most slow-paced water levels I've ever endured. I don't know if they tried to do this to differentiate Awesome Possum from Sonic, like, hey, Awesome Possum isn't like Sonic, he can swim. But it didn't work if that's what they were trying to do. I see the slopes, I see the rolling ball thing, I know what you're doing. I really didn't want to keep playing this even halfway through the second world, but I figured I'd at least give it a shot to see if it gets any worse since the game isn't very long. I played for about an hour and a half, and I can't explain to you how frustrated I was when I got a game over on literally the last level in the entire game, and it doesn't even seem like it's any fault of my own. Randomly out of nowhere, the game introduces insta-kill spikes like it's f***ing Mega Man, which is bad enough, but in the final level, there's this ridiculous death pit spring puzzle thing that you have absolutely no way to account for. You just need to jump and pray. I wasted like 6 lives that I had left in about 30 seconds just trying to get past this one part, which they put a checkpoint right before it, so they knew exactly what they were doing. Best part, the game apparently doesn't have continues. Cool. Very good. I'm very happy that I played this. Ever wanted to play Sonic the Hedgehog, but with a gun? No, not like that. Jazz Jackrabbit was one of those games that came out for the PC back in the 90s when PC gaming was like the Wild West. Never really knew what to expect, honestly, but Epic Games, who probably are most notable now at this point for being the Fortnite guys, came out with a 2D platformer based pretty heavily on Sonic, but naturally giving it its own weird 90s PC culture edge to it. It's set up similarly to a lot of other PC games at the time, with multiple different episodes containing a handful of levels each, and the episodes are played individually as opposed to a straight shot from the first stage to the last. In terms of it being an original game, there's not really much to elaborate on here. For what it is, it controls fairly well, but it just kind of seems like they didn't know what it wanted to be. Level design is a bit awkward and sloppy, and it's the kind of game that wants you to go fast, but punishes you pretty much every single time you try to. There is one exception, like when you get the speed upgrade along with invincibility, then you can fly through the stage, but the majority of this game will honestly have you tiptoeing trying not to get hit. A lot of the enemy placement is really cheap, and each stage is littered with enemies. The first couple handfuls of stages aren't anything too crazy and are pretty manageable, but it doesn't take long before the game's difficulty ramps up to a point where it gets pretty annoying. There is a difficulty selection, which has an easy mode, but there's also 2 harder modes, and I was only playing on the medium or normal difficulty, so I feel like it shouldn't really be this frustrating. I shudder to think what the harder difficulties must be like. Bosses are pretty cheap and annoying as well, but that's mainly because they're very fast-moving and the controls are so twitchy that sometimes it gets too chaotic to properly escape when you're about to be attacked. Like I said though, this game isn't necessarily bad. I actually did enjoy it initially for a while, but it kind of just starts going downhill pretty fast. Like I said, it's basically like Sonic, but you have a gun. It operates kind of like the weapons in Earthworm Jim now that I think about it. You have your standard shot, which has unlimited ammo, but as you progress through each stage, you pick up various other different types of weapons that have limited ammo. You'll pick up extra ammo throughout the stage as well, though, and you can swap shots on the fly, which you may want to depending on the specific situation you're currently in. I'll admit, though, I did get myself hurt on more than a couple occasions when every once in a while I forgot that this isn't a game where you can defeat enemies by bouncing on them. It's also very easy to die in this game, and it doesn't take many hits at all before you start to lose a handle on things and start praying you'll either run into a checkpoint or at least a carrot or two to replenish your health. There's also bonus stages, which, if this game didn't look like Sonic enough for you, I wonder where they got this idea from. You basically just run around collecting these diamond-looking things before time runs out, and if you manage to collect all of them, unfortunately, the only reward for you is a 1-up, which in my opinion really isn't worth all the trouble. It would be one thing if the bonus stages were fun, but honestly they're kinda clunky. It's really easy to accidentally run past one of the collectibles, thinking you got close enough to the object's collision, only to realize you now have to slowly and awkwardly turn back around to pick up whatever you missed. Also, I get really bad motion sickness, so this sucked for me. I will say though, at the very least, the music is surprisingly pretty good. I wasn't expecting it, but quite a few songs are pretty catchy and fit really well. That's all I really have to say about this one, honestly. It's definitely a relic of the past, but I guess it's worth checking out. The game did have both a sequel and a planned follow-up to that sequel, but both took a pretty different direction. Jazz Jackrabbit 2 takes a pretty different approach in its level design, leaning pretty far away from its Sonic-y roots, and there was even a 3D title that was being worked on. It was ultimately canceled, supposedly due to Epic not being able to secure a publisher for it, but there apparently is a leaked version of it in some form floating around. I did watch some footage of it briefly, but because it didn't really meet the criteria of this video, I didn't look much further into it, so I have no idea how far along that build of the game is that leaked. But hey, it's out there. Definitely a weird relic of the 90s kind of series, but it's at the very least interesting. It's just kind of strange, because it's clear that the quality is there, and it's a pretty beefy game all things considered. There's even a Christmas level pack that was released, but it's also pretty apparent that it never really took off. They're not still making Jazz Jackrabbit games. It's probably worth checking out just as a piece of history, especially since it's a little time capsule of the very beginnings of Epic Games and, honestly, 90s PC culture in general. Obviously, it's a very old game, but luckily there is an easily accessible GOG release that's available. So yeah, I don't know. Go check this out if it looks interesting. It's cheap. So out of all of these, this was actually the only one I had ever played before. However, I really didn't have much experience with it at all, and only played a stage or two when it first came out like 8 years ago. I don't know why it took me this long to actually really play it, because I did think highly of it when it came out, but God, I've been missing out. So, a little backstory. Freedom Planet was developed by a studio called Galaxy Trail, originally a one-person operation which subsequently expanded. It initially started its life out as a Sonic fan game, one of the countless others, but you can really only do so much when being tied to an established property. You still need to stick within the confines of it being a Sonic game to some degree. Eventually, the decision was made to shift focus into something more original, and Freedom Planet, as it was eventually released as, was born. But not before launching a Kickstarter campaign, which obviously ended up being successful. Now, a ton of Sonic DNA is still absolutely in this game, but it definitely succeeds in having its own identity, especially when it comes to how the story is handled. So I guess I'll touch on that first. I'm gonna be honest, I'm horrible at following stories in games. You're gonna see that going forward. That's gonna be a theme for this video, especially if I have to read dialogue. So this isn't going to be the video where I explain it to you, and honestly, given the framing of this video, I don't think it's very important. It's not like you're invested in these characters anyway. I have a hard time retaining story details, so I'm not the guy for that. Luckily, this game does have voice acting, which is also kind of a double-edged sword. The voice acting makes it a lot easier for me to digest what's going on, pay attention, and also get immersed into the world. But on the other side of the coin, a lot of this voice acting isn't great. Don't get me wrong, the voice of the main protagonists, Lilac, Carol, and Mila, are great, but a lot of the secondary characters sound very overacted, and a lot of the mixing and volume levels are just off. Some characters are just way too loud, it sounds like they're screaming, and some kind of sound like they didn't even record with a good microphone or in a good recording environment. I don't want to bash this all too much, none of it's like egregious, but it is hard not to notice. Ultimately though, adding voice acting to your game is pretty lofty, and this game does have a lot of dialogue, so I do have to commend the effort that they put in to actually add voice work at all. So visually, I think the game looks great. It is admittedly a little busy, but nothing really looks messy, and it's all very vibrant and colorful and pleasant to look at. It actually kind of looks like if Treasure made a Sonic game. Now, this might be a little bit of a hot take, but personally, I've never been a fan of how Treasure games look. To me, they're pretty busy and unpleasant, but in my opinion, Freedom Planet looks like if Treasure games looked good.
The game does look really polished though, and even looks good in instances where there's rotating sprites, an effect that I almost always think looks tacky, but in this case it works in my opinion. Like honestly, I didn't even like when they did it in Sonic Mania. I almost never liked that effect, but here it looks fine. Now the gameplay itself is like, how do I put this? Well, in the case of the main protagonist, Lilac, playing as her pretty much feels like a cross between classic Sonic and Rocket Knight, or Sparkster, for obvious reasons. She can run, double jump, and also has this boost ability which can be used to either do the Rocket Knight thing, or used on the ground as sort of a spin dash sort of mechanic. All three of these abilities use up your special meter at the top of the screen, which replenishes pretty quickly whenever you don't use the ability. The double jump can be used over and over until the meter is depleted, but the dash needs a full meter to be used, so sometimes you do need to stop for a second to let the meter refill, which is admittedly a little clunky, but it's nothing too bad. Naturally, Lilac is who I spent the game playing as, but I did try out the other playable characters just to see what they were like. Carol the Wildcat picks up some of the Sonic slack that's missing from Lilac, as she can roll just like Sonic, a mechanic that I do wish Lilac had. She also can wall jump to scale vertical surfaces and has a motorcycle power-up that can stick to walls. Mila, a f***ing dog, is completely different though, and even starts out on a completely different level when you start the campaign with her. She doesn't have some of the speed techniques that the other two have, but she can pick things up and throw them, create these green blocks she can throw, create a barrier which is also used defensively, and float, similarly to how Tails does. Now, I didn't touch on the level design yet, but, I mean, you see it. What you see is what you get here. It's very Sonic-like, but doesn't strictly stick to that at all. It has a lot of the speed and flow of classic Sonic level design and does occasionally borrow from some familiar stage gimmicks, but Freedom Planet also does a lot to incorporate wholly original ideas and gimmicks, and many stages aren't even linear. Some stages are set up as a maze, and some have separate mini-sections that you need to complete to progress further. It's nothing totally out of the realm of Sonic level design, and hell, even Sonic Mania did something similar years later with Titanic Monarch, but Freedom Planet has a good mix of both traditional left-to-right linear stages with some other weird ones thrown in to keep you on your toes. The bosses in this game are also surprisingly kind of difficult sometimes. They aren't super hard by any means, but you also can't just cheese them like you can in classic Sonic. They actually take some pattern memorization and require you to actually pay attention. Despite this though, they still mostly operate in a way where your skill can dictate how long the fights last, and not the other way around, where you have to wait 500 centuries to get through a boss fight because of scripted sequences and phases that the boss needs to go through after you inflict literally one hit of damage, like some other games that have come out recently. But yeah, Freedom Planet. Freedom Planet's good, go play it. Freedom Planet 2! Holy shit! So, a sequel to Freedom Planet finally came out about a year ago now, but I hadn't tried it till now, and it looks like I slept on this one harder than the first game. I knew it was in development for a pretty long time, and I was looking forward to it, but by the time it actually released, I guess it fell off my radar. Now, Freedom Planet's great, and it did everything it needed to, but after playing like 2 seconds of the sequel, I'm immediately kicking myself for not having played this the first day it dropped. This is a sequel that without question improves on the groundwork set by the first game. First of all, many of you probably know by now that my favorite game of all time is Sonic 2, I've said it a million times, and a lot of the reason I prefer it over 3 and Knuckles is because of the overall flow that exists in that game specifically. 3 is great, but 3 also sacrifices some of its flow for the sake of added precise platforming elements. 2, though, has a lot more kinetic level design. It still has its fair share of things that halt that flow, but overall, that game has a very fast, flowy energy to it. Freedom Planet 2 takes that design philosophy and cranks it up to 11. The stages are fast, flashy, flowy, and constantly engaging, all while avoiding a situation where you're just holding right to win. There's so many new and interesting stage gimmicks that constantly kept my attention. This is one of those games where I caught myself involuntarily smiling as I was playing. It's crazy. Once again, I'm not going to really delve into the story other than it takes place 3 years after the first, so it is a direct sequel. This time around, we have the option to play as the original 3 protagonists, Lilac, Carol, and Mila, as well as a new playable character, Nira, who was previously only a supporting character, now made part of the main cast. Much like the previous game, each has their own unique abilities that change up how you progress through the stages, which is always my favorite way to implement character options. I much prefer being able to go through stages I'm already familiar with brand new mechanics, rather than having totally separate campaigns. This kind of thing is something I always loved about classic Sonic, and it increases replayability for me like tenfold. With the exception of Nira, who is brand new this time and thus has her own new set of mechanics, the 3 original characters that were playable in Freedom Planet 1 have mostly similar controls, but they've been updated. I didn't spend much time yet as Carol or Mila, mainly just tried them out to see the differences compared to the first game, but it's all basically just updated versions of their original movesets. For example, Lilac's little Sparkster boost thing this time around works much better. Because her energy isn't being drained by her double jump, you have way more in the tank for the boost, which can now be used much more efficiently. And due to the way the stages are designed now, it's way more capable of being strategically used to blast through the stages. Nothing feels better than going 10,000 miles an hour off a ramp, jumping, and then using the boost to blaze through the stage. Now, Freedom Planet 1 was basically a series of stages split between cutscenes that glued them all together. Freedom Planet 2 is a little different. This time, we not only have a world map, but we also have multiple hubs throughout, which sometimes need to be visited to progress, but it's never anything that breaks up the pacing too bad, and there are some extra things to do in them, should you choose to. Groups of stages are also broken up by different episodes of varying difficulty. All levels do end up on the world map, but once you choose an episode, you're locked into a specific string of stages until that episode is completed. Once you finish it, you can choose to enter any completed stage of your choosing, but before then, you pick an episode and go along for the ride. Definitely an unconventional approach to progression, but I think it's kind of neat and unique. Now, one of Freedom Planet's strong suits, to me anyway, were the bosses. I thought they were great and expected way more of the player than any of the classic Sonic bosses, but without being annoying. Freedom Planet 2's bosses, while maybe being a little bit easier overall, are probably just as fun, but in a different way. I would say that learning the boss patterns isn't quite as difficult, but it's made up for by the fact that these fights are just a whole lot faster in terms of movement. There's a bit less pattern recognition required and more quick twitch skills and fast movement required. It's a slightly different approach, but I still really love these boss encounters. The voice acting is also greatly improved. I will say, it still does seem a little out of place to have voice acting, but like I said, I'd much rather listen to people speak than read text. And luckily, not only have the performances improved, but so has the leveling and mixing. All the vocals fit way more nicely into the overall mix with the background music, and no characters are shouting louder than the other this time. It's just much easier to listen to overall. Freedom Planet 1 was great, but Freedom Planet 2 really does improve on so much. Not in a way that makes the original one hard to go back to or anything, but in a way that can really make you appreciate the progression if you play them back to back. I definitely think you should play both, but in terms of overall fun factor, just based on the almost non-stop kinetic gameplay alone, Freedom Planet 2 is my favorite of the two. It taps into one of my favorite aspects of classic Sonic and totally succeeds, while still being its own thing and having its own identity. So this one's been on my radar for years at this point. I had heard about it from about 1 million different people, but for whatever reason, I never got around to playing it until now. Also, please excuse the erratic frame rate of my gameplay. I played it on my Steam Deck because it's easier for me to streamline my recording process, and it's really never an issue, but for whatever reason, this thing was chugging. I did not think this game would be this demanding, but apparently it doesn't want to play nice with the Steam Deck. But hopefully Channel Pup, who's editing this video, can replace my footage with something that doesn't look like ass. Anyway, Spark the Electric Jester is a very clearly Sonic-inspired 2D platformer, in more ways than one. The groundwork here was actually set by the developer's prior game, a Sonic fan game you may have heard of called Sonic After the Sequel. One of the more widely praised Sonic fan games, which I myself have played through and enjoyed. If you've played that game, you'll probably feel and see a similar vibe here. So you play as Spark, an electric jester, who lost his job as an electric jester to a robot who apparently is much more suited for the job of electric jester. Now Spark is on a mission to get his job back. It's a silly story and obviously doesn't take itself seriously, but it's all in good fun. So the controls here are Sonic-like at base level, but there's a lot more of an expanded moveset here. Spark not only can run and jump, but he can attack, wall jump, and dash, along with a slew of other advanced mechanics that come in the form of various power-ups this game has. See, Spark not only pulls from Sonic, but oddly enough, Kirby is a huge element here. Much like Kirby, Spark can obtain a bunch of power-ups that all have their own set of controls. Some only give you a different attack, while others do things like give you a double jump, or even turn you briefly into this sort of pseudo-supersonic thing where your movement speed and jump is temporarily increased. Not only that, but you can actually carry 2 power-ups at a time and swap between them on the fly with the touch of a button. Probably my favorite one was the one that gave me that little supersonic boost mode thing, because it feels good to be able to speed things up at will and blast through a section a little quicker. Speaking of blasting through, this is where my biggest gripe comes in. This game sort of feels like it's not really sure what it wants to be. At one moment, its feet are firmly in the ground of Sonic level design with loops and terrain evocative of classic Sonic stages like Chemical Plant and Hydro City. But then other times, it kind of feels like a totally different game, where it'll go huge stretches without any room for or need to move quickly at all, with tight platforming challenges and big rooms that need to be scaled vertically. These elements are fine in moderation, but when it gets to a point where it doesn't feel anything at all like Sonic after just feeling exactly like Sonic, it's a little bit jarring and feels kind of messy. Nothing here is really what I'd ever call bad, and there definitely is some smart ideas in here, but after getting through a handful of stages, the game did start to lose my attention in a pretty quick decline. Again, I'm not bashing the game, and it clearly took a lot of talent and passion, but I guess it just didn't do it for me. Maybe it will for you. A lot of people do seem to like it. I will say the bosses are pretty interesting. They're nothing too involved, and a lot of them you can take down by just kind of eating hits and spamming your attack, but they definitely do get quite a bit more difficult than I expected them to. And it's also kind of cool that each boss fight can be approached differently depending on what power-ups you currently have and choose to use. For example, I like going into a lot of the bosses that spend time on the ground with the ice power-up because it has this twirling attack that completely shreds the boss's health bar. So yeah, just because this game didn't really click with me doesn't mean it won't for you, and for a completely new property essentially based on the groundwork of a fan game, Spark really does do a whole lot to differentiate itself from Sonic, which is honestly probably why that issue that I have with the level design even exists at all. They clearly wanted to make something Sonic-inspired that has a Sonic feel to it, but without completely ripping off the level design itself. So yeah, either way, I definitely think you should check this one out if it seems interesting to you. Unfortunately, it's not on consoles, but it's like $8 on Steam, and I'd definitely say it's worth it. It has a lot of really cool ideas, and even though I'm not in love with all the level design itself, the power-up system is actually really cool, and it's fun to play through the game and find new power-ups that you haven't tried before. It gives the game a lot of variety and a lot of replayability for that reason alone. Okay, this one surprised the hell out of me. Yet another one that was kind of sort of on my radar, but if I'm being honest, I never really thought much of it, let alone really looked into it. I vaguely remember it being recommended to me years ago, but after so long, I totally forgot what it even actually was. See, they made a sequel to Spark the Electric Jester, and as it stands currently, as of the production of this video, I completely forgot what it was. Because before playing it, I assumed it was just what probably most people would assume, a regular sequel, more of the same, but with tightened up level design and polish. But that couldn't be further from the truth. They actually went a completely different direction when approaching the sequel, and instead of it following the classic Sonic formula, it forewent that for, well, a transition to 3D. Spark 2 is to Sonic Adventure what Spark 1 is to classic Sonic, and I couldn't be happier about it. This one takes a bit of a different spin narratively as well. Once again, I'm horrible at paying attention to stories and games, but this one has an overall darker tone to it as opposed to the much more silly nature of the first game. Instead of playing as Spark, this time you play as Fark, Spark's robot replacement doppelganger from the first game, who is on a quest to learn his real name, among other things. Now, I never really have high hopes when it comes to 3D indie games unless they have a ton of resources and backing behind them, and even then, it's very hit or miss. There are plenty of great indie or one-man show 2D platformers that are all amazing, or at the very least good, but good indie 3D platformers are very few and far between. Spark 2, though, is surprisingly polished. First off, the controls are great. I wouldn't say they're one-to-one with Sonic Adventure, but they don't really need to be. They're very close, especially in terms of the amount of agency you have over the character. Much like Sonic Adventure, you have full control over Fark without feeling like the game is forcibly pulling you in one direction. And this is necessary because despite having the capability to blast your way through the stages and make a beeline to the end goal, there's plenty of reasons to stop and smell the roses and explore a bit, like these collectible art floppy disks hidden throughout each level. The environments are all very interesting too. As the game progresses, I do wish they did a little bit more with the color palette for some visual variety, since it does taper off a little bit in that regard, but the majority of what's here is very unique looking and does keep my attention, which is more than I can say for a lot of stuff Sonic has done recently. Now, the game obviously takes a whole lot from Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, in a lot of areas that you probably wouldn't think about, like certain camera angles, for example. But in this case, obviously this is done in honor of Sonic Adventure, not necessarily to rip it off. Sega doesn't want to give us more Sonic Adventure, so now fans gotta pick up the slack, because Sonic fans do what Sega and Nintendo don't, or what Iizuka and Nintendo don't. The setup is also very similar to Sonic Adventure 2 as well, forgoing a hub world for a world map instead, which I'm totally fine with. I do love hub worlds generally, but I will say I always preferred Sonic Adventure 2's map screen over Station Square. The power-up system from Spark 1 was also brought back, further differentiating this game from Sonic Adventure and giving it a bit more of its own identity. The power-up movesets were expanded a bit, and you can now switch between 3 at a time on the fly. Each one changes up the gameplay just slightly, and one of them straight up unapologetically turns you into Shadow. The boss fights are also pretty fun as well. They aren't crazy involved, but in between every few stages you face off against a boss, and basically need to use the game's parry system if you want any chance of survival. If you get good at parrying, these bosses go down easy, but I will say, learning the window of when to parry for each attack is a little bit messy. Nothing game-breaking, it's fine, but it's something I definitely noticed. The music is also pretty good too. None of it's bad at all, and I'll admit some of it is a little forgettable, but there's actually a lot here that's really good and energizing, totally fitting in with the gameplay here. During boss fights, there's even this Crush 40-esque not Crush 40 song that fits right in. It took me by surprise and gave me a chuckle, but hey, it works. My only real gripe is, despite being as polished as it is, it does have some physics issues here and there, especially in the case of winding tracks. A lot of the time, there's a speed booster on the ground to set me up before a long stretch of winding road, and I'll kind of fall off the intended terrain and start running sideways. Nothing at all game-breaking, but it definitely did get a little bit annoying. That being said, I can't even complain super hard about it because it's not like the Sonic Adventure games are known for their airtight physics anyway, so who am I to judge? It's also not a particularly long game, really only a couple hours, but what's here is great, very fun, and the game doesn't overstay its welcome at all. I definitely, 5,000% suggest playing this game if you like the Sonic Adventure games and have never checked out Spark 2 before. I've literally done myself a disservice by not playing this until now. It does do enough of its own thing that it doesn't feel like it's just completely derivative of Sonic Adventure, but if you miss Sonic Adventure, this is a total Sonic Adventure love letter. So they made one more. Relatively recently, actually. Only a little over a year ago at this point it came out. Spark 3 once again follows the Sonic Adventure formula, but this time just really going the extra mile to polish and tighten everything up. Even more so than it already was. This time around, we're back to playing as Spark, and things are definitely a bit different this time. A lot of the mechanics from the first game have remained, but a good amount of new stuff has been added too. Powers and upgrades can be purchased from the shop, which are both now assignable to the D-pad. In the previous game, the powers were obtained through finding them in the stages, but since you could only carry 3 at a time, you needed to manually choose to lose one every time you picked up a new one that exceeds your limit. In Spark 3, they can be purchased from the shop, but must be equipped. You can still only carry 3 at a time, but luckily you can choose to equip or unequip them before starting a stage. There's also other special powers that can be purchased that do different things, like temporarily increase your speed, or you get to use a big explosive attack, and you basically need to choose the 3 slots you're given wisely because those slots are shared. The controls have also been tightened up a great deal. Not to say that Spark 2 was janky or anything, but I thought they definitely could have been improved, and it seems I was right, because this game absolutely nails it. Nails the controls, nails the physics. It's very responsive and just feels really good to play. And the level design this time around really lets you feel that. There's just so much room to blast through the stages, but still enough to explore where it feels like an adventure game and not a boost game. It actually surprised me just how much they were able to cram into these giant levels without leaving everything in your peripherals to just be set dressing. I will say I'm a little torn on the art style. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love this. It's colorful and creative and overall pleasing to look at. It's super polished, and truth be told, I'm not sure I necessarily prefer one over the other, but I will say Spark 2 did have some kind of weird charm to its art style and assets that, while clearly a little less polished, I guess to me were a little more abstract and weird, which I did kind of like. I'm totally not complaining at all, but it is a very noticeable change, at least in my opinion. Progression is similar to the second game as well, with a similar world map, only this time, there's a lot more meat on these bones. Not only does the game straight up start you on a driving stage, clearly paying homage to the driving segments from the adventure games, but there's also these mini challenge stages scattered throughout the map, almost sort of similar to something you'd see in Mario Sunshine, only these won't make you angry. What I mean is, there are normal stages that play into the story and are themed as such, but there are also these very platform-heavy geometry playground stages, and I think it's a really cool inclusion. Not all stages are get-to-the-end levels either. Many main stages do just require you to reach the end goal, but there's a good amount of them that require you to survey a big open level to find a certain amount of a collectible, almost sort of in the vein of the Emerald Shard levels, but also kind of not really. It's the same kind of idea relatively, but it's also its own thing. There's also these stages where you need to rack up a certain amount of points by defeating enemies, although these were probably my least favorite parts that I played. Once again, say it with me, class. I didn't pay much attention to the story, sorry, but it's very clear that this one is taking relatively the same road as Spark 2 did. The game actually does open up with a story recap, tying all the game's narratives tightly into a little easily digestible bow, so that is helpful. Unfortunately, I have digestive issues, so I still don't really know what's going on. It's probably the ADHD. Anyway, the bosses this time around are also pretty similar to the last. I will say these also feel just a little bit tighter, but I'll admit I'm still not the biggest fan of these. I would never say they're bad, not in the slightest, but I'm also really not too crazy about them, and I also just don't love boss fights that last a while due to the boss needing to eat like 800 hits before they go down. But that's just me. These boss fights are admittedly good and do require patience and careful parrying, but that's not really a reason I want to play a Sonic game or a game like Sonic. But I do understand this game is still trying to be its own thing, which I do respect. That being said, this absolutely 10 billion% still feels like a Sonic adventure game, at least in terms of the type of fun I'm having while I play it. It's a noticeable improvement over the game before it, and it even expands itself with a good amount more content than the last game. Just like Spark 2, if you're a Sonic Adventure fan and you haven't played this, you absolutely need to. It does enough original stuff to be its own thing, but I'll say it 100% scratches the Sonic Adventure itch, at least it did for me. Nothing's ever gonna necessarily replace a real continuation of the Sonic Adventure series, but if you've been missing that very specific type of speedy platforming, Spark the Electric Jester 3 is definitely it. And that's all the ones I checked out this time around. I know there's definitely some more floating around, and even one I actually wanted to cover in this video, but couldn't manage to figure out how to get the game running in time, but I guess there's always next time, right? I think honestly, there's a lot of stuff in here that surprised me. Sure, not everything was a gem. Awesome Possum sucked pretty damn bad, and Jazz Jackrabbit made me want to rip my hair out a little, but Freedom Planet 2 impressed me far more than I had any idea it would. Don't get me wrong either, Freedom Planet 1 is great too, and I definitely think more highly of it now than I even did when it first came out, but Freedom Planet 2 straight up knocks it out of the park. And Spark the Electric Jester 2 and 3 scratched this Sonic Adventure itch for me that I wasn't sure was ever getting scratched. Gross. Out of all these, obviously it's gonna be a no-brainer for me to suggest you check out both of the Freedom Planet games and the Spark series. I wasn't too crazy about Spark 1, but 2 and 3 are incredible games that really took me by surprise. Check them out if you haven't already, because if you're anything like me, you probably have no idea what you've been missing. Anyway, that's it for this one. Bye-bye! Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, they got a Patreon right there too.